So not only are we looking at legislation that could come up in the test from a US perspective, but you could also encounter questions related to European Union legislation. Hello and welcome back to Privacy Professional Training. My name is Fumi Owalabi. Today's video, we're going to be talking about methodology for studying for the CIPP US exam. So what I wanted to talk about today is different techniques that can be used to memorize different types of legislation for the CIPPUS exam. So one of the things you're going to encounter a lot when you study for the CIPP US exam, if you've had the chance to look at the body of knowledge, take a look at that. You can download it from the International Association of Privacy Professional Training website. So I want to talk about the legislation and techniques that you can use to memorize the laws and how they might impact the questions that you experience when you take the test. For me personally, one of the things that I like to do is for the CIPPUS exam specifically, I read the textbook through once, but what I started to do was to compile a list of all of the legislation associated with the examination. So in the United States, the privacy landscape is very fragmented, and increasingly so, and something you're going to encounter on the exam is you'll see that there's influences from our European counterparts. So not only are we looking at legislation that could come up in the test from a US perspective, but you could also encounter questions related to European Union legislation specific to privacy. This particular video, I'm going to talk about some of the key notes that I make a note of when I am writing down the legislation. As I read the book, I'll make sure that I list every piece of legislation that's mentioned. So this is very important because even though the exam is only 90 questions, you could have a question that looks at two different pieces of legislation. Let's say, for example, it's looking at a healthcare organization that also obtains financial transactions or something like that. It's really important to start listing each piece of legislation. And what you're going to think about when you do it is which pieces of personal data are applicable for this legislation. When we look at the state legislation, we're looking at privacy on a state landscape. When we look at it from a sectoral perspective, there is very specific terminology that identifies what the legislation applies to. For example, let's look at HIPAA. HIPAA applies to a specific group of entities, business associates, clearinghouses, etc. You're going to need to be able to list that. So for each piece of legislation, you should have a couple pieces of information that you definitely know. One, you should know what type of personal data it applies to. Two, you need to know who is the regulatory or enforcement body. Three, you need to be looking at if there's any exceptions or exemptions, because we're not just looking at things from a federal level. You're going to need to be able to understand it on a state level too. Each state has a specific way in which the legislation applies. Each state is going to have its own threshold and applicability. It may be that you're very good and you're able to have a photographic memory. For me personally, I need to be able to write it down. So when I encounter a piece of legislation, I make a list. I have my list. Let's say, for example, in the CIPP US exam, there are 30 pieces of legislation that you could encounter based on your review of the body of knowledge. So you need to write those pieces of legislation down. And for each piece of legislation, you should be writing which personal data identifiers does this law apply to. Not every privacy law in the United States applies to every single organization. If you are a business associate, then HIPAA is definitely going to apply to you. If you don't process protected health information, you may not have HIPAA obligations. So you need to be able to understand deeply who does this law apply to and write that down. So then second to that, I would write down the threshold. What is the threshold and applicability, specifically when it comes to state legislation? When we're looking at sectoral, I would also make sure that you understand the enforcement landscape. I will say that the body of knowledge for the CIPPUS exam in 2026, it doesn't touch on every piece of US state legislation, but what I can suggest is I think it's valuable for people that are preparing for the CIPPUS exam from a legislative perspective, and we'll get into other pieces of the body of knowledge in subsequent videos. But the one thing that I think is really valuable and helpful is to subscribe to the International Association of Privacy Professional. They have different newsletters for different geographies. So you can subscribe to the newsletter about what's happening in the US landscape. The reason why I think this is valuable with respect to looking at the legislation is you're going to start to be able to piece together enforcement actions against organizations based on legislation. So for example, sometimes you'll see a newsletter and it'll say something like HHS, which is the enforcement body for HIPAA, they have levied a fine against this organization for a particular practice. If you subscribe to the newsletter, you're going to be seeing periodically that IAPP is distributing this newsletter. I think I get the newsletter once a week. You can correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, but I believe that I get a newsletter for US once a week or twice a week. It's periodic essentially. But the value in doing that is, in addition to studying from the textbook and creating your own notes related to enforcement, thresholds, applicability, you're going to be able to see this enforcement in real time. And it's going to, I mean, I don't know how often you check your own emails, but I check my emails pretty frequently on a daily basis. So just having that insight into how this works in practice is going to be very valuable in addition to the theoretical understanding that you're having of this legislation. Definitely the pointers you should write down for each piece of legislation: who does it apply to? What are the thresholds or applicability? Are there exemptions? We know that there are several pieces of US state legislation where if there is a federal regulation that it's not going to apply. For example, in some US state legislation, we have exemptions for GLBA obligations. So if you don't know these acronyms, you're going to need to write down what the full name of the legislation is so that you can repeatedly remind yourself. It's going to be a lot easier to create your own personal notes. And I find that when I write things down, I actually am able to remember and memorize them a little bit better, as opposed to just reading the textbook through and being like, I understand the concepts. Because sometimes the sections related to enforcement or threshold or applicability may not be in the same chapter as just explaining what the law is, and also having a good understanding of what I meant to say, or what I mean to say is that the sections related to an explanation of what the law covers could be encountered in different parts of the book, and you're going to need to be able to piece that together. And your understanding of the law as a whole is going to assist you in the event that you encounter a scenario that discusses something like an exemption to the legislation. You're going to need to be able to understand very quickly when a particular law applies. So having a good foundational understanding of the thresholds and applicability is going to be very valuable. I also think it's very valuable to be able to understand some of these older laws that exist in the body of knowledge, like the VPPA, because what we're seeing generally in the privacy landscape is some of the language in a lot of these older privacy laws can be extended to some of the newer technologies. The other thing that I wanted to mention is I think it's valuable for people studying for the CIPP US exam to also subscribe to newsletters related to European Union legislation, because ever growing is influence of European Union legislation on US organizations. When you do eventually pass the CIPP US exam, you're going to see that companies in the US are becoming increasingly knowledgeable about potential obligations in the European Union. And as far as I understand from the body of knowledge for 2026, there is some discussion on EU legislation, particularly as it pertains to transfers, right? So you're going to need to be able to understand this very clearly. When does a transfer occur? Understanding the terminology. The other really valuable thing that I want to talk about is if you take a look on the IAPP website, they also have a glossary, and you can take a look at the glossary to see whether or not your understanding of the legislation is in line with what is listed on the official website, because essentially they're the ones that issue the exam. So having all of your resources together is going to be very valuable. And I think creating your own notes, listing out the thresholds, applicability, exemptions when they do apply, and also subscribing to newsletters by different organizations like the IAPP is going to be really valuable. So you can cross check between your understanding of how the law applies and enforcement actions and investigations that are currently ongoing in the United States. It's going to be invaluable for your studies for the CIPPUS exam, which is the Certified Information Privacy Professional exam for the United States. So I really hope you enjoyed this video and just had some additional insight as you continue to study for your exam. If you have any comments or questions about this video, leave them below and I will see you in another video.